resistance and critical thinking for disturbing times is a clarion call. It calls for forms of decolonizing therapy that can provide a bridge between the counseling room and social action. It calls for fugitive pedagogies in order to protect education as freedom. It calls for critical thinking about culture and for connecting with ancestral struggle to strengthen contemporary resistance. Significantly, this book also provides a sense of reassuring company to the reader through personal explorations of spirituality. Well, that's pretty bloody marvellous, isn't it? And it's particularly bloody marvellous because what a time we are in, with rising fascism and authoritarianism, particularly on the continent where Dr. Makungu Akinyela lives, but also in many other parts of the world. And this book to come out now so quickly and so thoughtfully really does feel like great company. This is the second launch of this book. How many launches are you having? There's two more coming, so they're on a rolling book launching tour. The first one took place in the First Nations Conference. What a place for it to happen. Was that a bit wonderful, Talia?
Bloody wonderful.
Bloody wonderful first launch, and now second launch. And this launch is a bit special. We've asked Marnie Sather to interview Dr. A. Dr. A's got a lot of names. He got a new one last week, didn't he? Isn't he now?
Yes,
Uncle Makungu? Dr. A. Anyway, many different names. And actually, names and the politics of naming is part of this book that you will hear about. You're going to learn all about Dr. A through this interview, and this book will, he himself will introduce himself, and this book will introduce himself, but also his people, the political movements of which he is part. He's also a counsellor, developer of testimony therapy, but he's also a scholar, Afrikaner scholar, and he's also a minister. In a radical tradition. So all those parts you'll get to hear from Makungu, Dr. A himself. But I want to say a little bit about Marnie, why we've asked Marnie to do this interview. Some of you might not know that Marnie is a dual citizen of Australia and the US. She's from Australia, but became a citizen of the US. When was that, Marnie?
2005.
In 2005. Now, has anyone become a citizen of the US? Do you know what that involves? You have to apparently take a Pledge of Allegiance. And when Marnie took the Pledge of Allegiance, I had to look it up, and you have to declare various things. And one of them was that you will bear arms in defense of the United States if it came under attack. Marnie was telling me a story. She said in the middle of her formal ceremony to the person, sorry, I just can't agree to that part. I can't say that I'll agree to bear arms. I will respond. I will find ways to respond if my country, if this other country, one of my two countries, is under attack. But it won't be in bearing arms, like I'll care for the sick, I'll do that. I think you offered a number of possibilities.
I'll care for the wounded, I
Care
said.
for the wounded. I think apparently the person was like, sorry, like that's not the usual way of taking the Pledge of Allegiance. So it was allegiance to particular principles, not to a nation state. And the country to which Marnie negotiated her allegiance is under attack at this moment, and Marnie is also trying to think through what actions can be taken, including sharing some of this book with colleagues back in California and trying to support action in relation to rising fascism on that country, in that land. So that's why we've asked Marnie to do this interview, and can we just thank both Marnie and Dr. Ray for being here for this conversation. From Chinganji?
Yes.
Hi Chinganji. So this book is dedicated. Just ask you to read your own dedication, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
About that.
To Chinganji Akinyela, my lifelong friend, my wife, and ride or die comrade, standing with me on the front lines of the struggle for freedom for over 45 years. Thank you for your confidence in my work and my dreams. And then also to my Tyler, Wheaton, and Thigpen ancestors, that great cloud of witnesses without whom I would not exist. Your resilience and defiance in the face of oppression has made me the person I am today. May this book express the best of who you hoped I'd be.
We might just give 3 cheers to Chinganji because there's no way this book would have existed without her. Can we just 3 cheers for Chinganji? Okay, now over to the 2 of you, and I'll just change the slide.
It's good to be here.
Good to be here. Hey, Mike.
Hey. So I thought to start with, I'd ask you about this beautiful book cover and the photos, because the photos represent different times of your life as an arc and the people that were important to you at that time. So just kind of wondering if you could tell us about the different arcs that the pictures relate to.
Okay. Well, the very first to the far my right is me at 16 years old.
What a sweetheart.
And it was about at 16 that I became outwardly politically active. I grew up in an activist family. My mother and father were civil rights activists in Mississippi. And we moved to California during what was called Freedom Summer, 1964. I was 10 years old. I grew up, by the time I was 16, the Black Power movement had catapulted in the West and the North of the United States. And so this is about the age that I ran out of the house against my parents' wishes and went to my first free political prisoner rally. It was a rally to free Huey P. Newton, who was the chairman of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. So that was my first introduction into what I call outward political activism. And I continued on from that time, from 16 to organizing walkouts during the Vietnam War, the day of Moratorium Day, when people all over the United States walked out. Jill, you were probably doing some similar things in your high school or whatever, where we commandeered record players and strung speakers all around the quad of our high school and played Country Joe's and the Fish's Vietnam Rag. You remember that one, Jill? Yeah, we only played the first part, the cheer. Give me an F! If you're not old enough to know that, go look it up. And so that was my fun period as a radical, rowdy teenager. The second picture is when I'm about 20, maybe 21 years old, and I was still doing community organizing. I had, by that time, joined the larger liberation movement for Black people, but I was a student leader on my campus. I believe this is probably I'm doing 2 things. I was a word poet, so I'm probably performing poetry, but it was to gather support for defunding support for South Africa at the time on my university campus. And that was about the time that the police first started following me and spying on me and stuff like that. Yeah, so that's how I tracked that. And then the third picture, I'm in my 30s when I'm well entrenched into our people's liberation movement. I'm a part of a larger movement historically that's called the New African Independence Movement. That's my people, New Africans. And at this time, there was a lot of pressure going on. A lot of our comrades had been arrested, or some had been killed, some had been exiled. And this is an event, I believe, for Malcolm X. And I guessed that I'm probably watching my wife speak, who's a very, brilliant speaker in her own. And she's probably talking about something important and significant at this event. And then the last one, that's the scholar me, I guess. That's a few years ago, as you can tell. Yes. But I think I was particularly really focused in doing mental health work for severely mentally ill people in a large practice that we had, like a hospital without walls, where we went to people's homes and under bridges and in communities to do mental health work at that time. So that's kind of the arc. All those stages of me.
Thank you. And also featured on the cover is your name. Could you tell us about the political history of your name?
Okay. My name is Makungu M. Akinyela, and it's a name that I was given when, again, I was about 18 years old. So somewhere in between there and by that time I had that name. When I was about 18 years old, it was a political decision. Growing up in the movement that I grew up in, the question of self-determination becomes very important. And a part of self-determination is rejecting the names of our colonizers and our enslavers. And so it was important to take a name that represented who I might have been if colonialism had never interfered in our lives. And so I was given the name Makungu, which means sunrise or beginning of a new day. Mshahiri is a Kiswahili word which means poet. I guess I still am, but at one time I was a serious poet where I even made money from it. My family name is Akinyela. Akinyela is Yoruba, which is actually, my mother is descended from Yoruba and Fulani people. And Yoruba, Akinyela means valor will conquer adversity. And so those names become important as acts of personal self-determination. The good news is that my children didn't have to be given names by other people. My children all never carried colonial names, or we would call them slave names. And from that time.
Thank you. So there's a lot of stories and resistance just in the cover. So in your book, you write about the idea of writing this book came in traveling to Martinique in 2023 with Cheryl, Serge and David to Fanon's birthplace. Can you say a little bit more about this? Why Martinique? And something about the histories of these partnerships, friendships, that have traversed Ghana, Georgia, Palestine, and Martinique.
It seemed like there was even somewhere else other than that, at least.
Rwanda?
Yeah, not Rwanda, but I'll think about it. It'll come up. But no, several people have asked me, how I happened to connect with the Dalit Center. I have known the folk from the Dalit Center since at least 1999 or 2000. I always mix the exact time up. When I accidentally stumbled on the Dalit Center through accidentally stumbling on a conference in Georgia for the AAMFT and being invited from there to a conference in Toronto, Canada by Stephen Madigan and meeting Charles Waldegrave and Tiwi Kamasesi, who then invited me to come to Adelaide. And I came to Adelaide and I met Cheryl and Michael, and David was there too, except David, y'all see my hair? David had hair much longer than mine. And I met all of them, and we've maintained a relationship since that time. After that first conference, David and Cheryl contacted me to ask to help organize the first narrative therapy conference in the U.S., and which we worked on together, which was in Atlanta, Georgia. And we've maintained that relationship since that time, as you said, visiting all those places together, usually to think about things and to talk about things. And I'm actually grateful for that, because it's that kind of engagement that has helped me to think about what I believe and how I think about this work of healing and therapy. We ended up in Martinique when Cheryl, as she usually does, gets a bright idea. And she wanted to think about and learn more about Fanon. If people have ever read any of my stuff, I usually talk about Fanon. I kind of, Fanon for me is like Foucault was for Michael. The idea of this, let's study about Fanon. So for about, what, 6 months? Yeah, so for 6 months, at least once a month, we would meet on Zoom. And we went through all of Fanon's books. We went through Black Skin, White Mask. We went through A Dying Colonialism. We went through The Wretched of the Earth, and maybe even a couple of others. We went through the major book that was just published in 2018 on Fanon and alienation, which has all of his medical writings, his case notes, his poetry, and we talked about that. And then said, well, we should go to Martinique, where Fanon is from, and talk about it there and see what we can find out about Fanon there. And Serge, where are you? In back. Serge was invited to that, and we had a really great time. And Serge was necessary because Martinique is a Francophone Caribbean country, and I would have been totally lost. But Serge, of course, speaks brilliant French and was able to help us. And it was in those conversations we talked about Fanon. We went and searched for Fanon, right? We looked for those places where Fanon talked about being. We talked about just our ideas, and it was out of that the idea for this book emerged, that we started talking about the possibility of pulling all these things together into a book. Yeah, so that's where that came from.
Thank you. And in the book, you write about the genuine, realistic fear, during these times in the US. And in the recent Meet the Author, you shared a story about speaking with Californian childcare workers and how you responded to their fears. The story was really significant to those who heard it, to those of us who heard it. Can you retell it here?
There's actually, you know how you're proud of your kids? My daughter lives in Northern California, and she decided to run for the school board of a small town, and she won against a maggot. A maggot is a person who belongs to the Republican MAGA party. We call them maggots. And she won. And then she also organizes childcare workers, mostly black women who keep children in their homes. They have small schools that they work with children. And those women are oftentimes exploited and marginalized. You have professionals and other people who kind of determine whether they can be licensed or things like that. And so my daughter works with organizing these child care workers. And they do things like go to the state capitol and campaign for policies, all these things. And my daughter called me because a lot of these women are really worried right now about the implications of some of the policies and decisions that are coming from Trump. And they just asked if I could get on with them and kind of help them do some things for some healing. And so it was my daughter, so of course I said I would, right? And so we got on, and what we basically did is, that song that you heard playing is from a women's a cappella group called Sweet Honey in the Rock, which was founded by Bernice Reagan, who was, as a university student, was a freedom singer. She worked throughout the South helping to raise money by singing songs like that. That particular song is called Breaths. And if you heard the words, it's listen more often to things than to being. It's the ancestors' breath where the fire's voice is heard. It's the ancestors' breath in the voice of the waters. And the importance of ancestry in my tradition is really important. Our ancestors are living history, they live in history. And when you hear me talk, you'll often hear me refer a lot to history. It's because I'm connecting to ancestor knowledge, ancestor wisdom. And so what we did is we began that call, which was a Zoom call, and we played the song, and I asked them just to listen to it. And then we did something else from our tradition. We poured a libation. And a libation in our tradition is pouring a drink offering. It can be water. When it's a real good party, it's rum, right? Something just to offer to our ancestors to say, we recognize you, we remember you, and to name our ancestors. And I had those women, as we poured, we made what's called the Biko, the libation statement. We made the libation statement, which gives honor first to the Creator and to all those who sit at the foot of the Creator. And we ask the ancestors to be with us as we remember their names. And I ask those women to call out the names of their personal ancestors. And, you know, as much as they could remember those names of their personal ancestors. We then ask them to name their greatest fear in this moment. What is your greatest fear? What are you most afraid of that will happen in this moment? And they began to name those fears. And once they named those fears, we asked them to close their eyes, and of those ancestors that they named, to call up the most bodacious, belligerent, meanest ancestor that they could think of that they had named. And we asked them, what would that ancestor tell you about that fear in this moment? And we gave them a moment to do that. And then one by one, the women began to report on what they heard from their ancestors, right? And who told them, you know, we've been through worse than this, we can do this together. You know, you should fight. You should not, don't be worried about this. We can get through this. They heard these encouraging messages from their ancestors, different messages they heard. But the important thing, again, and this is about the importance of orality and dialogue. As each person reports and says what they hear from their ancestors, the community gets the message. The community then takes in each of those messages. That's the importance of the dialogue and the community and hearing those words of encouragement. And so that call lasted for about an hour. By the time the call was coming to the end, now these women who had come in what we in testimony therapy call a doom and gloom telling of the story, they now began to pick out the victorious moments, and those victorious moments then had lifted them up where they were no longer afraid, and they began talking in planning ways about what they would do. They went to Sacramento the following week to challenge the state legislature, right? So that was kind of,
Yeah, how like in those victorious moments, how collective actions were then could be taken in Sacramento and policy and different things. In one of your interviews in the book Decolonized Counselling in a Time of Rising Fascism, you speak about the importance of witnessing reality and acknowledging survival. You also speak about how you are responding in the counselling room and supporting people to take collective actions. Can you say more about this?
I think what I said in there was that I think it's important for us not to take people's fears lightly or to pretend somehow that those things don't touch us. When people tell me that they're nervous, I acknowledge, yeah, I'm a little nervous too. In fact, I will say, you know, as old as I am, I have never seen this before. This is not something that we have seen before. It's a new thing. And yes, so it makes sense that you are nervous. But I also often ask people, so who are you connected with? What are you doing? Right? What community groups are you involved with? Right? It's as opposed to handling this on your own, right? This is not something that we can do alone. Are you connecting with any organizations? Are you connecting with any churches? What does that look like for you, right? Because oftentimes, I think one of the big things with this rising fascism, it wants us to scatter, to individuate, which is, of course, in Western psychology, that's the goal, but, you know, to individuate, right? But this is a time that calls for community and for us to be organized and together. whether it's being with your family, being with an organization, having conversations with your neighbors, but not seeing this as something that you can survive alone. So I try to remember to ask those questions, but also to validate people's fear. Yeah, I'm scared too. You know, this makes me nervous. I don't know what's going to happen. And I'm less fearful for myself because, you know, I don't know how many years I got left, but my grandchildren have time. You know, what will the world be like them to grow up in?
Yeah, I think in your book too, there's a story of practice that you share around working with a couple. So people can read that in the book.
Again, talking about the importance of ancestry and utilizing, again, you know, everybody may not have the same relationship to ancestry, say as my community, but there's something that is important to community, right? And so for us, that becomes a really important piece, acknowledging ancestry, acknowledging death in the ways that we do.
In speaking a little bit more about ancestry, in your book you also talk about how in the midst of crisis time, there is a need for increased recognition of learning from ancestors. Mm-hmm. You share how Black History Month is a collective ritual of honouring ancestors. Mm-hmm. And there are also some really powerful pieces that involve Ghanaian historian James. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us more about this section and acknowledging our ancestors and healing our lives?
Yeah, in there, I think we tell a story for that very first narrative therapy conference in Atlanta, 2001, right after the towers had been hit. As a part of preparing for that also, that was one of those first international trips that I took with Gerald and David. We went to Ghana, right, to connect some of the history of West Africa. And in Ghana, there are so-called slave castles. They're actually forts that were built first by the Portuguese. The British inhabited them. I think maybe the Spanish might have inhabited them. But they were established as training forts to trade with the indigenous kingdoms and nations in West Africa there. Over time, they stopped trading in primarily things like gold, which is what they were set up for. And they began trading in people. And they became the ports that people from all over Central and West Africa were brought to and warehoused in until they were put on ships to be brought across the Atlantic to the so-called Americas. When we went to Ghana, we met this young guy named James Amamasei. How does James say his last name? Amamasor, yes. And I think James was like 24 years old at that time, but he's this brilliant historian, right? And somehow he started just guiding us around the dungeon and giving us all this history and talking to us about it. And I tell the story. This is my first time ever returning to the continent, returning to Africa. He takes us through the dungeons. He takes us into the women's room where women were just crowded in, sometimes a space no bigger than this, and 300 or 400 people stacked in, right? People stacked on top of people. Even now, the floor is basically blood, feces, and urine that's hardened for the past 500 years. And he took us into these spaces. He showed us where the men were held, where the women were held. And then he took us to the doorway that goes out into the ocean to load people onto the boats to take them out. And that door is called the door of no return, because often it was the last sight of Africa that our people saw as they were put on those boats and sent for that 3, 4, 5-week trek across the ocean, lying in the bottom of a wooden ship, right? Being basically fed gruel, sitting in their own urine, their own blood, their own feces for 3, 4, 5 weeks as they crossed over, and to be sold on an auction block in the Americas. You go through that door, and the door now is like a regular door, but back then it was very thin, because by the time most of those Africans had sat in those cells for 3-4 months, sometimes as much as a year, they looked like the images that we often associate with Auschwitz. So they could fit through those doors. And that was the last site. And so James would have a ritual. He asked us to go through that door. For me, that was a harrowing experience, to go through that door. And then he asked me to turn around. And at the top of the door, it says, "The door returned." And he asked me to step through. And he said, "Welcome home." That was a powerful thing to hear. Welcome home. And that created a real lifelong connection with James, but also to understand that. Ghana has been very important for our people. Ghana was the first independent nation in Africa from colonialism. It's the home of Pan-Africanism. Someone else, Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, who I talk about a lot. He's second to Fanon for me. Du Bois is buried there. He finally, in 1964, when he just totally got fed up with the United States, because they kept accusing him of being a communist. He says, "I'm not a communist." They kept accusing him of being a communist. So finally, in 1964, at 99 years old, I think, he joined the Communist Party and moved to Ghana. Just to be spiteful, right? But he's buried there. And so Ghana has always been very important to our people. Even today, Ghana was one of the first African countries that gives our people dual citizenship. We can become citizens of Ghana. So that's very important. So since that, James has been really important since that time. When the conference in Atlanta was established, James was invited to come and speak, and we really wanted that to happen, but he could not get a visa. But he wrote the talk that he wanted to give, and I was very pleased to be able to read that talk to the people in Atlanta during that time, which talks about the importance of those histories and ancestral connections.
And I think some of James's words are in your book.
Yes, it's in the book, so you can see what James had to say as well.
Yeah. But that story really, it stands out when you read it. So, thank you for sharing it with us. I know David D is there and Cheryl. Throughout the book, and especially in the section Thinking Critically About Culture, you critique the idea of going back to the past as pure and classical. That the past, because the world is ever changing. At the same time, you demonstrate how things of the past can be vital for today. And also write about cultural resistance and how you and your people use the culture both as a shield and a weapon of liberation. Can you say a little bit more about the ways you think critically about culture and how you put culture to use, particularly in these disturbing times? Culture is
who we are. Culture, we live in culture. My notion of culture is grounded in what we call Africana critical theory. And for me, culture is dialectical. Culture is created in the asymmetrical relationships within society. There are asymmetrical relationships between men and women, the asymmetrical relationships between the rich and the poor, the asymmetrical relationships amongst black people between dark-skinned people and people like me. I'm Kathy Olay, right? Right? Or very light-skinned people. Those asymmetrical differences create tensions. And it's in those tensions that culture is created. It's where culture rises up from. And culture never remains the same. It's constantly evolving, constantly changing. Again, Fanon says Each generation, out of relative obscurity, must discover its mission and either fulfill it or betray it. In other words, in each generation, we add to and create new aspects of culture. Now, what are the seeds of that? It's tradition. So tradition is important. That's why, even though some people try to argue that Black people in America don't have a culture, we have an African culture. We are Africans, right? Are we Africans the way the Africans were 500 years ago before 1492? No. We're new Africans. We're the Africans of this time period. But guess what? The Africans in Ghana are not the same Africans from 1492. A lot of them are walking around named Edward. My name is Makungu. Right? Colonialism has impacted all of us. So culture is constantly changing, constantly dynamic. It's a dialectic, right? And so we can never go back to what our culture was, but we can always grasp what our culture is becoming, right? And through holding on to tradition, remembering our ancestors' voices, remembering our traditions, it's that thread that makes us who we are, continuing to be African in each moment in time. Does that make sense?
Thank you. This was
I feel like going amen. Is that what you're doing?
Ashe.
A response of some sort.
Yes. This was a particularly favourite part of my book about fugitive pedagogies. So you're a university teacher, and in your book you mention how you and your students at the university are turning to fugitive pedagogies at this time, when universities in the US are under attack. Can you say something about this and the histories of fugitive pedagogy?
That's a hard word.
I'm feeling like a fugitive at the moment.
Yes. Actually, that idea of fugitive pedagogies, I think in the book I talk about it. I want to find it, because it's an idea that's not my idea. That's an idea that comes from a really great book written by
Jarvis Gibbons. It's called Fugitive Pedagogies. And the book uses the biography of Carter G. Woodson, who is the creator, the founder of Black History Month. He established it as Negro History Week back in the 1920s. But Carter G. Woodson was an African man, a Black man, who was educated by his two uncles who were freed slaves. They were, and he was educated by them. He went on to become, I think, the second Black person to earn a PhD out of Harvard. And he was an educator. And what he began to do is write specifically about the education of Black people in America. His most famous book is a book called The Miseducation of the Negro, where he argued that what I would today call colonial education miseducated particularly the Black upper class to hate themselves, to deny themselves, and to love the colonizer. And so therefore, they failed their people. He called that miseducation. He began to document and write the histories and examination of the culture of Black people. He established the Association of Negro Life and History, which today continues 100 years later as the Association of African American Life and History. They documented history, cultural ways, sociology, and that association began to train Black teachers who were teaching in public schools, teaching in other areas, and train them in the historical, cultural ways of Black people. The book is called Fugitive Pedagogies because oftentimes teaching the true history and sociology and culture of Black people was illegal, right? You had to teach what white people said about Black people. But this kind of underground movement began to develop amongst Black teachers influenced by Carter G. Woodson and the Association of Negro Life and History. And in the book that Jarvis writes, he talks about a young black teacher sitting in the classroom with their student, with a American history book on the desk, which is the curriculum that's supposed to be taught. But in her lap is one of Carter G. Woodson's books on Negro history. And she's teaching from Carter G. Woodson's book. And she has a student sitting at the door watching out to make sure that no one comes by who will see what they're doing, which is illegal. And the other students also know. So if someone comes by, she is able to quickly close this book, begin teaching from this book, and the students just act like nothing happened. They go right along with the game. He says, the book is called Fugitive Pedagogies. He's using the idea of the runaway slave, right? That this was a pedagogy that was using the tactics and the ideas of those runaways, those rebellious people who refused to be slaves. And they found ways to do what we call counter-hegemonic work in education. So my students got really excited in talking about ideas of fugitive pedagogies. But it's important to know that that's not my term. That's a term from the book Fugitive Pedagogies. Yes.
I really enjoyed learning more about Tessie. I think that was the teacher's name.
And those are things that we have to, that again, it was important. The class that I teach is called Critical Pedagogy in African American Education. And we're seeing as the Department of Education has been destroyed in the United States, as rules and laws are being passed about what we're supposed to be able to teach and what we can't teach. And so for that class, we said, what does this mean for us? How can we use this history, this knowledge of our ancestors, right? If our ancestors refuse to be tied up and tied down by racist laws, why should we? And what lessons can we learn from that?
And there was also like an intellectual underground movement, as you were saying, that provided the teachers with the text.
Yes, that was part. They produced books, they produced literature, histories, and they would do workshops to train these black teachers so that then they could go back into their communities. If they didn't do it in the school, they held classes in churches or in gymnasiums so that people could come and learn. They would do Saturday classes for children to come. They would go to the white controlled schools in the day, and on the weekend they go to black schools to learn what they really needed to learn to survive.
So this brings us to your final section in the book. Black religion, resistance, and revolutionary spirituality. Speaks to your own spiritual and religious histories and how you draw on these at this time. Your experiences are connected to those of the ancestors who for 400 years drew from black religion and spirituality in times they didn't know if they could survive. And you also grew up in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. You are a minister within this church. Why was it important to conclude this book with a chapter on revolutionary spirituality?
I believe that real change is revolutionary change. That it has to be a transformation of the entire society. That ultimately, what we do in the classroom, what we do in the therapy room, is we provide people with an experience of freedom. And as people get that experience of freedom in the classroom, in the therapy room, it gives them the strength and the power then to take freedom in the larger society, right? But we've got to create spaces. In the tradition of the spiritual tradition of my people, we have what are called brush harbors. The brush harbors were places where enslaved people could get away to in the woods, back in the outback, and they would cut down trees and bushes, and they would create huts large enough for the numbers of people to get into, where they could actually worship the way they wanted to, away from the eyes of white enslavers, who often had laws that, for instance, black people could not have religious worships or services unless a white man was present. They had to be a white person present to witness to make sure that they were doing things right. But these brush harbors were spaces where they could have freedom. They could worship the way they wanted. They could worship in their African ways. That spirit of the brush harbor continues now. It's those spaces. It's that indigenous peoples only space to have to talk about narrative therapy the way indigenous people want to talk about it, right? It's at home, it's barbershops and beauty parlors and what we call fish fries, those spaces where Black people gather socially and are able to interact and talk about the things that we want to talk about. That becomes really important. That's spiritual. It becomes important to maintain revolution, I believe, to maintain a spiritual connection. One of the things that I noticed as a young person is that over time, many of my comrades began to burn out. They burnt out, and because they were alienated and disconnected, I got this from my brother Paul as well. As they got disconnected, you feel that disconnection, that alienation with other things, alcohol, drugs, bad behavior, because you have that alienation and disconnection. That's why I believe spirituality becomes important. I grew up in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was a church grounded in social justice and resistance to white supremacy. I left the church then, when I was 16, because the church was too slow, right? But I mean, they wanted slow change. I wanted revolutionary change, right? I still want revolutionary change, but I found a way to reconcile it 14, 15 years later at 30 years old, when I was feeling that burnout, seeing people being burnt out, and I happened to come back to an African Methodist church, which allowed people to come with all their African self, with all their radical political self, and engage in those activities, and had an understanding of the Creator, which fit our African ways of being and understanding. That was really important. And it was through that I began to re-engage and understand the importance of, once again, tradition, but tradition that also makes room for change. Understood the importance of connecting ritual, of the place of ritual in our lives, giving us a sense of balance, and understood that European or Eurocentric ideas of God are not the only ideas and ways that God can exist, right? This idea of this old white guy sitting on a throne somewhere, is not necessary, right? That there are other ways of thinking about the Creator and the creation that fits more the traditions of our ancestors from West Africa. As I became stronger in that, I see the importance of that. And that doesn't mean that everyone has to choose to follow Christian tradition as I chose. I have my own understandings. My best friend follows traditional African tradition. He's what's called a Babalao in Ifa tradition. I have a second best friend. We're all three best friends together. He's a Muslim, right? But we all honor our ancestors, for instance. We all get together, we pour libation to honor our ancestors. And we understand that, but that spiritual tradition becomes very important. It's what makes our people the people that we are. Does that make sense?
Very much so. Well, thank you. We've got through all the sections of the book. We did. Do you think this would be a good time for people to turn to each other and have a bit of a chat and then come back? Would you be open to some more questions?
Whatever you say, Mark.
Oh, okay.
I'm always open.
Yeah. We've also got Lift Every Voice and Sing to close, whatever things you were just talking about that. It could just be time for a song, I reckon. What do you reckon?
Okay.
Any questions?
Up to you.
Let's have the
I'm a
conversation.
Libran. Okay. So I'm like, I'm not
I know.
in a position.
Let's have the conversation.
Have a conversation. Okay. So, okay. So we go right to questions then. Okay. I'll go now.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Makungu. I have both a comment to make and a question. I was really honored to read your book and hear you today speaking particularly about spirituality as part of the political practice was something that really stood out to me. because in much of the therapeutic training that I've been part of, not the narrative therapy but other trainings, this link between spiritual practice and political resistance is often either severed or treated with suspicion. So I have noticed that there is a division in many fields, including in therapy fields, where spirituality and political resistance are often framed as separate realms, or even worse, treated as irrelevant or destructive to therapeutic or clinical work. So I really appreciated the way that you write and speak today about this deep interdependence of these two. And it has me thinking also, as a narrative practitioner myself, what are the practices that can help us reclaim this connection in our own work. And my question is, in your book, you talk about this image of marching on, in the end. So, in this conversation on revolutionary spirituality, this image stands out to me as both holding ancestral, as you said, ancestral weight or connection, and forward-looking lens and approach. But my question is, what does marching on look like when the path is in the future feels like precarious, So how do you imagine tending to that uncertainty while still passing on strength and imagination and resistance to future generations?
Thank you, Cassandra. If I understand correctly, that term, I think in the last chapter, I think that is, Let Us March On, it comes from the Black National Anthem, our people's national anthem. And it's actually, I believe, a statement of defiance, right? Because in the song, it talks about treading through the blood of the slaughtered, the conditions that we've been through. But that last line says, let us march on till victory is won. It's an act of defiance. And I believe for oppressed people, a bit of defiance is necessary, right? There's a few years ago when Trump first started going crazy, now they're attacking DEI. Back then they were attacking critical race theory. And critical race theory, of course, is a legal theory that was developed by black legal people to critique the law. And it basically argues that within American jurisprudence, within American legality, that white supremacy is baked in, is built in. Consequently, what critical race theory says is that at least as long as that jurisprudence exists, racism will always exist. Some people say, oh my God, that is so defeatist. That is so depressing to think that racism will always exist. The critical race theorists argue, no, it's not a defeatist position. It's racial realism, right? But also, what that requires is understanding that regardless of that, we are going to stand. We are going to continue to fight. We're going to continue to march on. We don't know what the future will hold or what it will be like, but we know that if we don't march on, it's going to be like this. But in our movement, in our resistance, in our refusing to submit, we know that the possibility of a brighter future lies ahead. Does that make sense? So it's a statement of resistance, and I believe that position of resistance has been central to what black people over these years and most colonized people have done, even if it's small ways of resisting, right? But it's that resistance. Someone asked the question, where's the hope? That's where the hope lies. As long as I can resist, there is hope. Does that make sense?
Let's hear the national anthem. Sure. Are you happy to do signings?
Huh?
You happy to do signings?
What are signs?
Sign your beautiful book.
You're speaking Australian to me. I don't.
You stand for this song, don't you?
Yes.
Yeah.
David wants to play the national anthem, Black national anthem. We first sang this together in Palestine, collaborating with my comrades from Palestine. So, and hopefully this is one that has clear words so you can hear the words as they're said, right?
So just a way of the second launch of this wonderful book in these extremely disturbing times. The book ends with this song,
Yes.
so it feels pretty appropriate to. Oh, that doesn't sound like it.
That was something
That was an upbeat version. Ring with the harmonies of liberty, and the loving rise as the lifting skies, every with the rolling sea. Sing the song of the faith that has brought us. Sing a song of the faith that has brought us. In the rising tide of love, we have begun. Let us march on till victory.
This is called the bridge. This is the last bridge. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on our way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever on the path we pray.